If I asked you to get a piece of paper and something to write with, and to make a numerical list of all the things that you would be willing to die for, how long is your list?
Panther 48.
Willing to die for.
Panther 48.
Willing to die for. How long is your list?
What is the tribal self?
Panther
The
48.
tribal self is what goes above the immediate acquaintances of the social.
Willing to die
The
for.
family, the people you know, live next door.
You would be willing
I'm
to
talking
die
about
for.
tribal self.
Panther 48.
I'm talking about those movies, those yes unheard.
Let's go ahead and get started here. So before I share the screen, I do want to let it be known that if anybody wants a copy of the document, and I do encourage everyone to want a copy of the document, that all you have to do is just leave an email address for me to send it to you after class is over. So later on tonight, I'll be shooting out that email blast and sending the document to everybody. Which I think reason why I think that's important is because oftentimes when we're going over the subject matters, especially because I like to kind of dive into psychology, the deal is you may have to go through the document, and sometimes what I'm saying may not necessarily resonate right then and there. And I'm just an advocate for homework and for study, and for us to make progressive change, we need to be willing to do that, just that, as well as the document will have a book included in it. So without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. And let me just get an acknowledgement for somebody that y'all can see screen as well as y'all can hear me. Can y'all see the screen?
Yes.
And hear me? Okay, good deal. All right. So San Diego Black Panther Party, today's build, political education build, is on social resistance versus reactance, and identifying our cause and be cause. So opening this up, we're going to talk about a part that was extracted from the book 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Elevate yourself above the battlefield. In war, strategy is the art of commanding the entire military operation. Tactics, on the other hand, is the skill of forming up the army for battle itself and dealing with the immediate needs of the battlefield. To have the power that only strategy can bring, you must be able to elevate yourself above the battlefield to focus on your long-term objectives, to craft an entire campaign to get out of the reactive mode that so many battles in life lock us into, or lock you into. And that's really the essence of what we're going to be talking about, is because when you think about a strategy from that sense, and we'll dive into this a little more toward the end, but when you think about a strategy as it applies to what's going on with resistance, it's basically you having what we call an intentional kinetic action that is driving you to see a specific result, whereas reactive, and we're talking about, we'll be diving into this deeper, but reactive is basically you dealing with an immediate emotional impulse that does not tend to lead toward future results. So let's go into this further. So resistance versus reactance. These two terms must be discussed because in recent years, the line has blurred in regards to their distinction. Without a clear understanding of our actions, we are left with no concrete direction, and therefore any potential position of power will never take shape and operate kinetically. If the masses simply exhaust anger and frustration and don't establish a clear, intentional, principled organization towards liberation, the condition will only continue to get worse. Perception is your reality. Having a flawed perception will lead to misjudgments, misunderstandings, and miscommunications. It prevents us from seeing things as they truly are and can hinder our ability to make informed decisions or form accurate conclusions about navigating our way from an oppressive existence in any section of society. It is important to be aware of and acknowledge one's own flawed perceptions, as well as to be open to feedback and different perspectives in order to overcome them. Developing critical thinking skills, seeking out diverse viewpoints, and practicing paths of self-sufficiency will directly counter flawed perceptions and neurological connect accuracy and balance of reality while navigating the social construct of the world. Social resistance and reactance are two closely related concepts that play a significant role in shaping our human behavior and interaction with self and others. They operate on different underlying mechanisms. While both involve a form of opposition and defiance, there are distinct differences between the two that have important implications and understandings how to address/respond to social influence, authority, sovereign thought/consciousness, and collective self-determination. So let's explore key differences between social resistance and reactance. So in going into defining the character of social resistance and reactance, the character of resistance comes in two forms. We typically refer to this as the yin and yang of conflict and balance. Social resistance is often driven by a desire for social change or reform. Now, when we talk about it from that standpoint, keep in mind that there are various and varying degrees of resistance, which we're not going to get into tonight, but just the mere difference between the concept of engaging in resistance as opposed to engaging in reactance is the key point here we're getting at. Individuals engaging in social resistance may be motivated by a sense of injustice, a desire to challenge authority, or a belief or cause or ideology. Social resistance is typically a collective effort involving groups of individuals working together to challenge the status quo. And that's one of the major aspects that we have to keep in mind when we're talking about this, is that when you engage in resistance, usually it implies a group of people as opposed to an individual. So passive resistance is a form of nonviolent resistance in which individuals or groups refuse to comply with certain laws, policies, or practices as a way of protesting or bringing about social change. This can include acts of civil disobedience, non-cooperation, and peaceful protests. The goal of social passive resistance is to challenge unjust systems and practices without resorting to violence. On a personal level, passive resistance also involves holding out on relationship bonds or emotional connections in order to force a specific demand or expectation. Passive resistance in the theater of war is referred to as holding a defensive position. So this is kind of going into what we talked about when we stated the yin and yang. So the active resistance refers to a form of direct action or protest in which individuals or groups actively resist or confront oppressive systems or practices. Unlike passive resistance, which may involve nonviolent tactics such as civil disobedience or boycotts, active resistance often involves more assertive or confrontational actions. This can include prolonged protests, boycotts, strikes, blockades, sabotage, and other forms of direct action aimed at disrupting or challenging the status quo. Active resistance involves the awareness of positional power, and that's one of the key points here. Because notice how passive resistance can get into protests, but active resistance typically gets into what we refer to as prolonged protests, as well as those that are involved in active resistance realize they have the awareness of what we call positional power. It knows that consequence should and can be applied on both sides of the combative line, knowing that those in power are only guaranteed to respond to a felt presence that reflects the opposite flow of force, gives those under the oppressive continuum an activated just resistance cause. Active resistance in the theater of war is referred to as holding an offensive position. And so this is key that we gauge this when we talk about the two. as it applies to the yin and yang of conflict balance. You have passive resistance and you have active resistance. Now, the nature of reaction. Reactance is a psychological phenomenon that occurs when individuals feel their freedom or autonomy is being threatened. Reactance is a natural response to perceived constraints on one's freedoms, leading to feelings of anger, defiance, or increased motivation to assert one's autonomy. Reactance is more individualistic response arising from personal need for control or autonomy. So with that being said, before we build any further, I would like to see if anybody would want to give an example of a personal reflection on reactance.
Okay. I think an example of personal reactance or reflection on reactance is probably all I can think of is like the most basic example of like a kid staying up past their bedtime, even though it's not the best for them in the long term.
That's a good example. In fact, that's one of the examples we use later on. Anybody else? All right, and also real quick before I move further, for those that came in after the fact, if you want a copy of the document that we're going over, just drop your email in the chat and I'll make sure you get a copy of it. All right, let me keep moving. So this is where it gets deep here, and this is the essence of why we have to go into this here. So in order to manipulate reactance, it is important to provide individuals with the appearance of choice by way of framing options that allow them to feel a sense of control over their circumstances. By framing messages in a way that emphasizes the benefits of compliance rather than focus on restrictions or implementations, it is possible to reduce reactance and foster a more predictable, neuter response. It is also important to communicate with the perception of empathy and understanding, acknowledging individuals' feelings and reactance and validating their need to autonomy. And the reason why we bring that up is because the core concept of addressing and knowing and operating through the difference between resistance versus reactance is because oftentimes when the masses of people operate through their initial response or should we say reaction to an issue or a problem or something that has happened. Hold on a second. I lost my share. Okay, to something that has happened, what tends to happen is those that are in power know that they can sedate the masses of people to a level of reactance to the point to where it fizzles itself out. Often when we talk about even the right to protest, when you allow people to operate at that capacity, and even like when the police, typically when you see protests and the police, like, you know, let you go down the street and they won't interrupt the protest, oftentimes just feeling like you have the ability to voice your opinion and block traffic and just get out there and be heard will help quell the fire that needs to be burning to allow you to actually take this to a further action to deal with the reality of that things will not change until you make change. Simply protesting about an action will not bring about change. So from a reactive standpoint, protest is perfect. So what you attempt to do is you allow just enough reactance to take place to where the people can feel like they are operating through a position of power. And this ends up with what we call circumstantial power. And because of that, people tend to think that they are operating through resistance when in fact they're doing certain things that quantify as reactance. And so that tends to actually be a form of manipulation that is used by the masses, because the line is subtly drawn oftentimes between the difference. And when the masses of people don't see that, they will not realize why they were not motivated to move beyond just the mere element of protest. And so that's important. So underlining mechanisms of social reactance as a neutralizer to the consciousness of social growth. So that's what we're getting into when we talk about it from that standpoint. Reactance psychology. Reactance psychology is a theory that explains how individuals react when their freedoms or autonomy is threatened or restricted. It is a concept that has been studied extensively in the field of psychology and has important implications in understanding human behavior and motivation. Let's explore some key principles of reactance psychology and its impact on decision-making and strategies for mitigating reactance. This is also referred to as controlled chaos. In looking at the book, 48 Laws of Power, we're going to start quoting some elements of the 48 Laws of Power so that you can see the connection and how the dots are drawn. Oh, somebody asking the question, could isolated hate crimes be considered, hold on just a second. Let me read that. Could isolated hate crimes be considered a result of manipulated reactance? I would say you're looking at it, we have to look at it from two points. If we're talking about an act that has taken place by an individual based upon a certain level of prejudice that caused them to create an emotional response to commit a crime, that can be an element of a reactance. But now how we respond to the mannerism or the climate or the environment that continues to fuel the atmosphere for these type of acts to go unpunished and to basically be, when we say unpunished, we have to look at it from multiple levels. Number one, how often do people get away with these crimes? Or how is the rule of enforcement as it applies to actual justice applied to where a certain person of one ethnic group, it gets a certain type of punishment or very little at all, and another group gets maximum punishment. So it all depends on how it's applied, but we have to see it from both sides of the fence. All right, so going into 48 Laws of Power, number 12. Use selective honesty and generosity to disarm your victim. One sincere and honest move will cover over a dozen of dishonest ones. Open-hearted gestures of honesty and generosity bring down the guard of even the most suspicious people. Once your selective honesty opens a hole in their armor, you can deceive and manipulate them at will, a timely gift. Trojan horse will serve the same purpose. And that's important, people, because too often we allow selective honesty to be an excuse for certain type of repressive and oppressive actions. Someone may admit to having a moment, even kind of like what was asked earlier, having a moment of instability, but then cover up the fact that that actually was not necessarily a crime of passion or me being outside of myself. And I'm now asking you to excuse that behavior, knowing good and well that I was actually intentionally manipulating the entire situation and trying to use my a human behavior pattern as an example to get a pass. And so there's different ways that you can manipulate a population that we have to be aware of that takes place. So key principles of reactance psychology. One of the key principles of reactance psychology is the idea of a reactance arousal. This refers to the emotional state that individuals experience when their freedoms is threatened. The arousal can lead to a range of responses including increased motivation to assert one's autonomy, defiance, and resistance to authority. Reactance arousal is often accompanied by feelings of anger, frustration, and a sense of injustice. And this is what leads us to, want to band up and protest and express our instability or that we don't support the system and that something has to change. Another important principle of reactance psychology is the idea of reactance restoration. This refers to the behaviors that individuals engage in to restore their sense of freedom and autonomy. These behaviors can take many forms, such as defiance, rebellion, or even increased motivation to assert one's autonomy. Reactance restoration is a natural response to perceived threats of one's freedom and is a way for individuals to regain a sense of control over their circumstances. It is not necessarily true control over the circumstances, but a sense of control. Because you have to keep in mind, as long as these same patterns of oppression continue to be repeated and repeated and repeated, then that means that there is still a flaw, that things are still gone unaddressed. Key principles of reactance psychology. One of the key principles of reactance psychology, I'm sorry, I just said this, right? Here we go. Law number 48. 48 laws in power, I'm sorry, law number 31. Control the options, get others to play the cards you deal. The best deception are the ones that seem to give the other persons a choice. Your victims feel they are in control, but in actuality, you're puppets. Give them options that come out in your favor, whichever way they choose. Force them to make choices between the lesser of two evils, both of which serve your purpose. Put them on the horns of dilemma, and they are gorged forever. I'm sorry, they're gorged wherever they turn. And that's important because what you have to realize, and we go over this oftentimes in the Panther formations, where we talk about what we call the difference between choices, options, and decisions. Whereas oftentimes our choices have been removed, which is what create those perceptions of the glass ceilings, and we're left with options. Too often people in positions of power and dominance will remove choice and leave you with options. And when they leave you with options, and keep in mind, this is all perceptive power. When they make you think that they are giving you a choice, when in fact they're giving you options, by flooding you with multiple options, often we misassociate that with an actual choice. And so therefore we pick from these options. And by picking from these options, that means that you are agreeing to play the game. And no matter how good of a game player you are, the bottom line, as long as you are playing somebody else's game, they are the puppet master. And this is what we have to realize. Often this goes in the form of just even how definitions are defined and how words are used and how language is conducted and how culture is projected or removed. So we have to realize that these things operate not only from a physical standpoint, which is the predominant one that we describe when we talk about reactance and resistance, but you have to realize this moves into the theater of physical, mental, spiritual, and psychological. So we tend to only equate what we can directly see, which is a physical act, but not realizing that there's oftentimes mental, psychological, spiritual, and emotional, and all types of connecting factors that go into these situations. So manifestations of reactance. Reactance psychology can manifest in a variety of environments and conditions, from everyday interactions to more serious conflicts. In everyday life, reactance can be seen in responses to rules, regulations, or restrictions that individuals perceive as limiting their freedom. For example, like was stated earlier, a child may become defiant when they're told they can't have a certain toy, or an employee may resist following a new policy that they feel restricts their autonomy. In a more serious circumstances, reactance can lead to conflict and situational resistance to authority. This can be seen in moments of social justice where individuals feel their rights are being threatened and engage in protest or activism to insert their autonomy. But reactance can also manifest in relationships where individuals may resist attempts to control or manipulate them, leading to conflict and discord. So the initial symptom of both can be one and the same. But what we have to be able to distinguish from people when we talk about engaging in organization that is going to make progressive change is that a symptom is not the same as a problem. And so therefore, when we want to talk about being solution based, we have to have a solution to a problem. You can't have a solution to a symptom. That is called suppressant. So when we talk about the psychological warfare and weaponization against the population, this is how reactance is weaponized, because I may come off in the symptoms, address the symptoms of something. By addressing the symptoms, I am creating suppressants, and therefore the visualization may seem as though things are not as bad or the problems are getting addressed. But what we're not recognizing is that a symptom suppressant has the appearance that the problem is gone, but it is not gone because it is still there and continues to basically show his head over and over and over, and the conditions don't change, they just get worse. And so we begin to nullify ourselves or numb ourselves to the fact that these are happening. 48 laws of power, law number 43. Work on the hearts and minds of others. Coercion creates a reaction that will eventually work against you. You must seduce others into wanting to move in your direction. A person you have seduced becomes your loyal pawn. And the way you seduce others is to operate on their individual psychologies and weaknesses. Soften up their resistance by working on their emotions, playing on what they hold dear to and what they fear. Ignore the hearts and minds of others, and they will grow to hate you. So this is, when we talk about the 48 laws of power, this is one of the concepts from a psychological standpoint that they use when it comes to reactance to keep you in the reactance zone. Impact on decision making. Reactance psychology has important implications for decision making, as individuals may make choices based on their needs to assert their autonomy. For example, individuals may be more likely to resist a suggestion or instruction if they feel it threatens their freedom. This can lead to decisions that are based on emotions rather than rationality, as individuals may prioritize their need for autonomy over other considerations. This is where reaction can bite you in the ass. Reactance can also influence how individuals respond to persuasive messages. When individuals feel their freedom is being threatened, they may be more likely to resist or reject the message, even if it's in their best interest. This can make it challenging for authorities or influencers to persuade others to change their behaviors or beliefs unless applying reverse psychology, which in essence, reverse psychology and reactance are like one and the same. Number 32 on the 48 laws of power. Play through people's fantasies. The truth is often avoided because it is ugly and unpleasant. Never appeal to truth and reality unless you are prepared for the anger that comes from disenchantment. Life is so harsh and distressing that people who can manufacture romance or conjure up fantasies are like oases in the desert. Everyone flocks to them. There is a great power in tapping into fantasies of the masses. So remember that, because it's about manipulating the people, the population, and not getting us to realize the subtle difference in line between resistance and reactance. So by understanding the principles of reactance psychology as seen and applied in controlled chaos, a person can read the patterns of manipulation, thereby allowing them to move into intentional resistance. And that's the whole point here. Only through the awareness and movement of conscious direct action towards empowerment and the ability to gain distinctive insight on global charting will you be able to construct governance without being doomed by the same cycle of government in order to maintain social mass awareness and direct synchronization. So in a nutshell, what we're saying here is as you start being able to detect reactance and reactance manipulation, then you're able to draw the line where it is necessary for you to be able to implement resistance and resistance-led tactics. So manifesting the spirit of social resistance through analysis. This is where it gets important when we talk about critical thinking and critical consciousness. Administering social resistance requires different strategies depending on the underlying mechanisms and motivations involved. It is important to engage with individuals and groups in a visionary manner by listening to their concerns, acknowledging their grievances, and working towards the process of solution building that addresses people's needs. It is possible to reduce reactance and promote the use of emotional energy in a way that can transform collective organization from the initial mobilization. So what we're saying on that part is that if we are able to deal with and address things, like we said, by drawing a line and a distinction between a symptom and a problem, and then approach it with a process of solution building, now we're able to get on the track of dealing with actual resistance, which is the mode that we all must be operating from when we talk about collective empowerment. So grand strategy, extracted and modified from the 33 strategies of war. So grand strategy is a science of looking beyond the battle and calculating ahead. It requires focus on the ultimate goal and considering the politics and long-term consequences of what you do in order to bring about self-determination. To become a grand strategist in life, you must follow the path of power. First, clarify your life, decipher your own personal riddles by determining what it is that you are destined to achieve for your people and the direction in which your skills and talents seem to fuel collective action. Visualize yourself fulfilling the destiny in glorious detail. Ignore the conventional channeled wisdom about what you should or should not be doing. It may make sense for sheeple, but it does not bear any relation to your goals and destiny to break from domesticated dependence. You need to be patiently visionary enough to plot several steps ahead to wage a campaign instead of fighting battles. And I know it's a lot said there. Again, get a copy of this document. Just drop your email in the chat. The last point here. Your task as a grand strategist is to extend your visionary move in all directions. Not only look further into the future, but also seeing more of the world around you, more than your enemy does. This is the reversal of controlled chaos. Again, this was modified from the book 33 Strategies of War. Now in the book Revolutionary Suicide, Huey P. Newton discusses the concept of resistance in an active form through the context of revolutionary struggle and social change. Huey emphasizes the importance of active resistance and direct action by challenging oppressive systems and fighting for justice. He contends that passive acceptance of injustice will not bring about change in our social conditions, and the true liberation requires a willingness to confront those in power. This is the idea of revolutionary suicide, which is defined as the willingness to sacrifice one's life for the greater good of the revolution. True revolutionaries must be willing to make personal sacrifices and take risks in order to advance the cause of social justice and liberation. Revolutionary suicide advocates for a form of resistance that is bold, courageous, and unapologetic in its pursuit of social change. This form of resistance is a necessary tool for dismantling oppressive systems and create a more just and equitable society. But let's go into this deeper, because there's two schools of thoughts when we talk about Panther ideology. And that one is the one that is the most promoted, because there were different schools of thoughts in regards to one of them being, and this is what I get into a lot, but not necessarily we're going to dive into today. But one being with Kwame Ture, Stokely Carmichael, and the other side being Huey P. Newton. Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture talked about it from this standpoint. Another Panther ideological approach opposes the concept of suicide as a reference point and sees resistance as a natural stage of progression in warfare against the empire. In other words, instead of viewing our experiences from the lens of the victim and manipulating the dysfunction of one type of suicide over another, this approach refers back to the pre-damage state and sees the weaponization of cultural integrity. By viewing resistance through the case of colonization and genocide, the natural process of demanding the right to self-determination and repair is the expectation granted to any people finding themselves in bondage. The perception that we must address survival through programs pending revolution is met with the notion we must form decolonization programs in order to make revolution. The condition we suffer from are not just material. Society has been conditioned to be codependent on being exploited. The masses are psychologically lynched into accepting altered realities that don't express a working government model outside of imperialism being able to generate advancement. So that's taking it a step deeper. So mind you, most of our people are suffering from post-traumatic slave disorder. So with that being stated, we end up suppressing a lot of our abilities just to deal with the day-to-day lifestyles. So we get dragged into what we call in the Panther formations, coping. So most people are dealing with obstacles. Most people are basically finding ways to maneuver around oppression as opposed to being able to resolve oppression. And since we become good maneuvers of oppression, we call it the coping mechanism. And I may be good at navigating the battlefield from that standpoint. I get good at being able to go up and down an obstacle course. And so therefore, I never actually address the root problems of oppression. But what I end up doing is dealing with the suppression of the symptoms. And so by dealing with the suppression of the symptoms, that may take me into what we call revolutionary suicide mode, which means that I know that the lifestyle that I live is going to kill me. I know that some of the things that I do are very dysfunctional and don't make no sense at all. Well, at least I can do revolutionary acts that will help to alter the path of oppression that's taking place. So in other words, revolutionary suicide speaks to the average person because we are damaged. But now when you talk about addressing the second point of view and dealing with things as it applies toward realizing that the natural stage of progression of warfare goes into us knowing that we are dealing with cultural destruction and a way of life, and we are dealing with a people that are basically taught to be domesticated in their mindset. And we talk about the pre-state of our existence before we allowed ourselves to be stripped, especially as it applies to Africans here captive in the United States, before we allowed ourselves to be stripped of all of our way of life. And keep in mind, the concept of codependence is operated on all levels. So not only do we deal with that as a Black experience, but just as the average person. One of the biggest things that we suffer from in terms of an entitlement that creates these scenarios for us here in the United States is our easy access to creatures of comfort, things that we can basically have access to that will prevent us from resisting too much, because we got our air conditions, we got our Nintendos, we got our video games, we got our TV, we got all these luxuries that get in the way of us realizing that from a global domination perspective, the majority of nations are not experiencing the levels of luxury that we are, because the United States and a good percentage of the European power structures are oppressing and exploiting the rest of the world. So because we're here behind enemy lines, we have to be treated a lot better in order to maintain the level of empire that is needed, so that those external forces, those external people in other countries can continue to be exploited the way they are. And so we have to realize that this is what's going on. And so when we talk about the distinction between reacting and resistance, we have to be able to draw that line of clarification and know that when we're acting upon something, are we acting upon resistance, or are we just acting upon the reactance of a specific act that continually happens, but now I'm pissed off because it is happening to someone close to me. Whereas all along, I've known that there's been this type of oppression. All along, I know that there's corruption, but not until it came to my doorstep did I feel the need to now try to be involved. And at that point, what level of involvement am I going to take part in? So let me move on. We're almost done here. So why is this linkage of conduction? This is why the linkage of conduction was hidden between strategic planning and tactical awareness. The rebuilding of a way that places power within the context of liberation is required. Humanity is not going to simply get better because it should. The lifestyle cycles of death has to be intentionally stopped, reversed, and replaced with a living cycle. And let me break that down a little bit further with this chart here. So most of us are familiar with strategy and tactics, but we often seem to forget that there is a middle ground here. And when we talk about levels of war, it's typically referred to as operational. You have strategy, you have operations, and you have tactical. Within the Panther movement and the Panther parties, we refer to it as strategy, conduction, and tactics, because there has to be a conduit that sits in between strategy and tactics that allow, whether we talk about physical, spiritual, or mental, a connection that is made between the different levels of warfare and in the applications of warfare. And so therefore, when you look at this chart, it defines and goes over the strategic level of war, the operational level of war, and the tactical level of war. Now, notice what encompasses all of them is what we call institution. So when it comes to implementing power, the highest level of that is when you institutionalize a concept or a way of life. And therefore, it becomes a perpetual lifestyle cycle that the people fall for or become victim for or follow suit of. So going back to that concept earlier, when we talk about grand strategy or being a grand strategic, it has to do with that visionary awareness, which is also coupled through policy, which basically means regulation or republic, which oftentimes people tend to forget the United States of America is a republic. People tend to forget that. You learn the Pledge of Allegiance, but you forget that it's a republic. Oftentimes you ask people what kind of system are we under, and people want to say a democracy instead of understanding that it's a republic. But the whole point in what I'm saying when I talk about that is that the grand strategy has to do with being in a position that puts you at a level of institutionalizing the entire operation of strategy, strategy, operation, and tactics, or strategy, conduction, and tactics, being able to put this whole entire theater of war into play. And so that's something that we have to pull back into our conscious awareness as a tool of understanding when we go out and we deal with the wars that are taking place, whether it be in our minds, in our within our family structures, in our communities, with ourselves, with community in which dealing with self-determination at whatever level that we need to be operating from. We need to realize that we have to deal with this from a holistic standpoint as it applies to addressing warfare. Next thing here that we want to talk about as we close out here is the Dunning-Kruger effect. Now, what makes this is important, and I'm not going to necessarily dive through this chart, but again, if you want a copy of this document, just put your email in the chat. The deal is with the Dunning-Kruger effect is what that covers, for those that are not familiar with it, is that oftentimes, and this is real important when we talk about social media, because social media right now, a lot of the things that we get exposed to are just simply the tip of the iceberg of the actual vastness of the subject matter. But what the Dunning-Kruger effect talks about is the fact that sometimes, oftentimes, we know just enough about a subject to think that we know something about this subject, but unaware of the fact that we actually know very little about the subject, but think we know more about the subject than what we really do. So now all of a sudden, everybody wants to be influencers. Everybody wants to be an expert on a subject matter because they watched a 2-hour video and they want to run with it and they want to repost it and they want to act like they're informing the community about something when they only touch the tip of the iceberg. Or even greater, they've been approaching it the wrong way because they've only, again, got exposed to a very little bit of it. So the Dunning-Kruger effect talks about the fact that when you don't know that you don't know, and you think you know, then you become dangerous, basically. And so that is the unconscious incompetence. And so the idea is that we give ourselves the opportunity to grow, that we embrace education. This is why we call everything political education within the Black Panther Party. We embrace the fact that in order for us to even address self-governance, we have to be able to understand all governance. And so that even means studying a system that you may call yourself hating. Oftentimes, when we're turned off to something, it causes us not to be able to see it for what it is so that we can even form a proper defense against it. So that's one of the things we have to realize is that we may be turned off about something or turned off on something, and that causes us to reject the aspects of learning how that element operates so that you can form a defense against it and an offense against it, where we talk about passive or active resistance. You have to be able to form a weapon against it. But if you don't truly know it for what it is, because you are turned off on it, or you don't really study the subject matter, then what happens is you actually do more damage than good. And you end up putting yourself in a position where you're not going to actually have a lifestyle of kinetic, operational, synchronized, direct action. And that's what we want to move toward. So as we get ready to close out here, law number 48, assume formlessness. By taking a shape, by having a visible plan, you open yourself to attack. Instead of taking a form from your enemy to grasp, keep yourself adaptable and on the move. Accept the fact that nothing is certain and no law is fixed. The best way to protect yourself is to be fluid and formless as water. Never bet on a stable or lasting order. Everything changes, and this is why we say revolution. G-Can-Do favors formlessness so that it can assume all forms. And since G-Can-Do has no style, it can fit with all styles. As a result, G-Can-Do utilizes all ways and is bound by none. And likewise uses any technique which serves to its end. And we refer to that typically now and from a combative sports as mixed martial arts. Another quote by Bruce Lee here. Defeat is a state of mind. No one is ever defeated until defeat has been accepted as a reality. All power to the people. Now, the last point I want to make here, very few people are aware that the father of American ninjutsu was a brother by the name of Ronald Duncan. This is the man that brought the concept of that level of warfare to the United States. Ronald Duncan. And this is a video link to him. And the reason why I bring that up is because the book that's attached to today's class as we finish, and I want to point out this disclaimer, this supplemental reference book is provided for informational purposes only and is copyrighted material. The inclusion of this book is not intended to produce any financial benefit for this presentation and is not for sale. Please purchase the book to support the author's work. Now, in saying that, a lot of the things that I address come out of or referred to in this book. Ancient and modern ninja techniques, mind manipulation. The author here, pen name is Dr. Ha Lung, and he has an entire series on dealing with mental and psychological warfare from the mindset of a martial scientist. And so it is very important that we expose ourselves to these things and what they provide, because they will provide you with very good insight on being able to identify patterns of manipulation so that you can prevent yourselves from being trapped in the process of reactance and being in which will allow you to be able to form the proper response of advancing your life through the means of resistance. And so this particular book has been attached to the document. And so I wanted to make sure that's made available, because within the Black Panther Party, when we give these classes, our goal is to raise the consciousness of the people. And by raising the consciousness of the people, we can get what we need to do in society.
History is a clock. History tells of people where they have been and what they have been. History is a clock. Where they are and what they are. Most important, history tells a people their political and cultural time of day, where they still must go and what they still must be.
Archery that not only decimated Persian ranks, but targeted the eyes of individual Persian warriors.
History is a
One
clock.
historical source notes. So from the battlements, as though on the walls of a citadel,
History is
the
a
archers
clock.
kept up with a continual discharge of well-aimed shafts, so dense that the Persians had the sensation of a cloud descending upon them,
blot out the sun.
especially when the Ethiopians made their enemies' eyes the targets. So unerring was their aim at those who they pierced with their shafts,
History is a clock.
rushed about wildly in the throngs, with the arrows projecting from their eyes like double
Our
boots.
We'll blot out the sun.
Honestly, what more is there to say?
History is a clock.
Kush by this time was world-renowned. Even when other nations dreamed of taking
But they
Kush,
still must go,
they dreamed of taking an
but
L.
they still must be.
For example, the Greeks.
History is a clock.
The Greeks had a very strange tendency to romanticize the Kushites. By this time especially, they've heard so much about them. After many Greek historians and scholars went to Egypt to study, they inevitably heard about the Kandaki warrior queens of
But
Kush.
they still must be.
The Greeks respected the military bravery and prowess of the Kushites, so much so that they wrote a romance referring to their military
We'll blot
might.
out the sun.
The story is mentioned as part of the Alexander romance. The legend goes like this.
History is a clock.
When Alexander attempted to conquer Nubia
Political
in
and cultural time of day.
332 BC, the Kandaki warrior queen of Kush arranged her armies strategically to meet him
We'll blot out the
and
sun.
was present on a war elephant when he approached.
History tells a people.
Having assessed the strength of her army, blot out the sun, Alexander decided to withdraw from Nubia.
History is a clock.
Heading to Egypt
For they
instead.
still must go, what they still must be.
Non-African nations immortalized
History
Kush
is a
and its
clock.
military strength, blot out the sun, not even dreaming of going through the heartache of attempting to conquer it.
The relationship of history to the people is the same as the relationship of a mother to her child.